Mark Twain, the two most important days in your life are the day you are born and the day you find out why. He has some incredible quotes here. So
You,
you talk a lot about the American psyche, and I think a lot about electorates, right? Because if you want to know which politician will be elected, you have to understand the people, what they want, what they're looking for in new candidates. If you look at his approval rating, Trump's approval rating is down underwater 23 points. If you look at the generic ballot polling, the Democrats are now starting to surge a bit more. They're up 6 points. But I want to know, how do you assess whole populations, and how can they embody certain sets of archetypes, and how do you use that to understand electorates?
yeah, so, archetypes are, of course, not personal only. We have personal expressions of them, but they're also collective. And entire eras, institutions, and populations all can become organized around certain dominant psychic patterns. So, for example, in post-war America, we had, very strong explorer, sovereign kind of energy. We can do this, rebuilding and optimism in the 50s, and everybody bought appliances like crazy and was trying to get their wealth on and these kinds of things. And then we have, or for instance, Silicon Valley as a, immediately brings out in many people the idea of renegade, explorer, sort of dreamer kind of energy, thinking archetypally, or bureaucratic states when we get too much into bureaucracy, that we think about too much strategist. That's a collective experience. Or, revolutionary periods, of course, renegade and warrior, which is a little bit what we have now. There's just sort of like, sticking the finger to institutions and to traditions and to beliefs that people hold, and these kinds of things, is a renegade warrior kind of energy. It's not new. It's an old idea. We've done that. America was founded on that. There's these kinds of things going on. You have consumer culture, which is another very American thing. More is better, and if I have more stuff and newer stuff, I'm better than you, and these kinds of things. That's a lover amplification. Too much lover. Too much. I love this. I love my car. My car is great. She's a sweetie. Those kinds of ideas. That's lover. Or social media is, storyteller and renegade. Unpredictability, fake news is a fabulous renegade, trickster, storyteller kind of word. So that's the modern era that we live in now. So, but what happens is that a culture often over-identifies with, a few archetypes, and that's who we are, and that then means that we disown others. So we're not really well balanced. It becomes kind of extreme, and in my mind, a little bit boring. But that's how we can even define certain eras by these sort of over-identifications with certain archetypes, as I just described.
Yeah.
So
And I'm curious, you talk a little bit about your the top three and the bottom three. Is there a bottom three that you have in mind that the American people are not necessarily using in terms of
yeah, I think the
archetypes?
nurture. I think there's very little nurture in the United States right now. Nobody cares about anyone else. There's not a lot of, care. Care has been corporatized, and care has been made crazy expensive and unaffordable for many. So if you can sort of buy care, but it's like buying a lover or buying a mother. You can buy care if you're rich, but if you're not rich, you can't. And so the fact that we have people who are uninsured is unfathomable to me, being in Sweden, where, sure, there's huge problems with healthcare everywhere in the world, and it's overpriced and people can't afford it, and all of that is true. But you get care here, and nobody's going to, not get the care that they need. And they pay, a tenth or whatever else that we pay on average for the same services. And so there's a lot of work to be done on the nurture in the United States, to care more about other people, and it's funny because the nurture is the moon astrologically, and the moon, of course, rules the sign Cancer, and America is a Cancer sign. So we're so far away from that sort of the nature of our sun sign as a culture. That's really, to me, just how far we've come and gone off, the deep end, if you want. So those are some of the archetypes that I think are missing. I think there's, not a lot of dreamer right now. There's sort of fake dreamer. There's a lot of illusions that are being shown. Yes, everything is great. Gas prices are peanuts. They're not expensive. That's sort of false dreamer, But real dreamer, which is what we're talking about before, hope, vision, and image that we can all gather around, that is actually, pro-human and encompassing and together. You know, that
Hmm.
this notion that we were a great image, if we talk about imagination as a culture, bring me your poor and dishuddled and disheveled. I don't know the line exactly. I wasn't raised in the States.
Huddled
Thank you. Bring your
masses,
huddled masses. Thanks very
yearning to
much.
breathe
Exactly.
free, something like
Bring me
that.
the,
Yeah.
that's an image that people would, that really set the tone for this country for a long time. Think about how far we've come from that idea. Now we, send the army to the border. It's a different notion. So the world has changed. Our archetypes have changed collectively. And so we pay a price for those that we neglect, just like a human being does. If I don't have access to my own nurturer, then people will consider me cold and not caring, and nobody wants to work for me because I'm just, a slave driver, and I
Hmm.
just make people do what I want, and I'm not kind. I don't care. On the other hand, if I have strong nurture, I might, say, if you need to take time off for having a child, or if you need to come to the family picnic that we have for everybody, then it's a different kind of a notion.
Two things before I let you go that I need to ask you about. First, just general like planetary alignments for the rest of the year. What do you see necessarily if they correspond with any political disruption, institutional change? But I also want to ask you about two things that can really change on a dime: AI and aliens or extraterrestrial life in the age of Aquarius. What are your thoughts just across the board?
So, yeah, so to me, that's really the big question of the time. Many people have heard about the age of Aquarius, sort of to understand what kind of time we're in, again, to ask the qualitative question. I look at the big picture, the big shift that's going on is from Pisces into Aquarius. That's the big moment that we're in. It's not a thing that happens overnight. It's not like flipping a light switch. It takes, decades, maybe more, maybe over 100 years. I don't know. But it's certainly, I can recognize a lot of the Aquarian things that are emerging, and I can see how a lot of the Piscean things are changing into something new because they're no longer at the core of our thinking. Each era, so as we enter the age of Aquarius, each era doesn't show up as a singular era, but shows up as a dyad itself between the sign that we're entering and the opposite sign. So Leo doesn't show up, Aquarius doesn't show up alone. It shows up as the dyad between Leo and Aquarius. So if you want to understand how that looks in the practical world, a great example is that just yesterday, I believe, or yeah, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, the Pope, who, by the way, calls himself Leo, that's a choice, which is a really
Yes.
interesting as a representation of singular man versus the collective. That's the dyad. The tension is between me as an individual, me, I, my solar self, my inner sovereignty. That's the Leo part of me, and the collective, the part that makes me part of everyone and humanity as a whole. And it doesn't matter what I look like or who I am individually because the collective matters more. That tension is the tension of our time and will be for a long, long time in my mind. That's what we're trying to figure out. The question of our time is this: how can I be a grain of sand on a beach and remain individual? And that is really the question. That's not easily answered. And it's not taking the extreme of it's all about me and Instagram and social media and making myself, have 1,000 followers and being at the top of an old fashioned pyramid and being the best and the finest and the star. That's not the idea. That's the Leo extreme. And the collective, where I don't really matter, where I'm just part of the complete system. I become a data, and it's not about me as an individual. I become basically a digitized, number that is in various systems that can be used for certain advantages. Is the opposite extreme. The movie The Matrix really shows this very well. If you remember The Matrix, especially the first
Mhm.
one, where you have, Neo, which translates into one, that singular. If you do the anagram, the one Neo fighting the system, the Matrix, of just being literally in it, plugged into the system and being part of the system versus keeping the individuality. And so that's the struggle of our time. But then when the Pope comes out with this, the Magnifica Humanitas, the 83-page manifesto that's called an encyclical, which was essentially talking about the dangers of the matrix and the collective versus the individual. And it's just, to me, it's reading the news archetypally and making sense of the things that we're reading and what this conversation is about, what that struggle is about, what these times are about. And, what we each have to do independently is find our place in this dyad. How much do I participate in the collective and how much do I stay myself as I am participating in this collective? That is the big question. So, as far as what's going on between now and the rest of the year and through the election period, I think we're going to see in general, and this is again archetypal forecasting, not a prediction.
Hmm.
You can make out of
Right.
that what you want, but I see an acceleration of Uranus, which is more unpredictability, more craziness, more things that we can't really see, because Uranus is definitely activating in Gemini and triggering all kinds of other planets and stuff in the sky. So that's an interesting, exciting, unpredictable time. What I keep telling my clients and everyone else is expect the unexpected. That's a sort of a funny thing to say because it doesn't make sense, but that's the times that we live in. Expect the unexpected. Even the idea that we could predict or know what's going to happen to me is a joke because it's particularly unpredictable at this time, even though it's always unpredictable, but now it's particularly unpredictable, which doesn't make sense. There's a Uranian
Right.
statement for you right there. The absurd, is also Uranian. Imagine more absurd things. The most absurd things you could imagine are sort of taking place in front of our eyes, part of it politically and part of it just in the world in general. It doesn't make sense because it's absurd, because it's Uranian. We'll see much more AI and decentralization. That's a big theme of Uranus and Aquarius, the decentralization idea. Much more fragmentation and of authority. We see that already now. States saying, well, fine, if the federal government can't do it, then we'll have to do it ourselves. That's a fragmentation of sorts.
Right.
Nervous system exhaustion, which we're seeing everywhere. That's the the Mercury story that's happening. And then identity destabilization that's happening all the time. That's the me. What is happening to me? How do I even fit in here? I don't know who I am anymore. Massive breakdowns for people, breakthroughs, breakdowns, all kinds of things happening. Many of my friends are therapists and they're reporting massive amounts of young people coming in just not being able to cope. It's a very difficult time. And fear all over the place. People just graduated right now, no jobs. Nobody wants what I just learned. What am I going to do? How am I going to survive? These are real things. There's a sort of a collective reality testing. And this very much to me also, there's lots of talk everywhere. I moved to the States 40 years ago, 40 plus years ago. And if you mentioned you were an astrologer, people would laugh their heads off or think you worked for NASA because they didn't know what that meant. That happened to me many times. Someone asked me if I had a telescope in my backyard. I mean, the astrologers just was so weird. Now astrology is everywhere, and it's also bad everywhere in many places. There's a lot of what I call Instagram astrology that's just, garbage. Just like pop
Yep.
psychology, I'm an introvert, I'm an extrovert, therefore I behave like this. It's human nature to want to know more about themselves, but I encourage people, if you really want to, do it the way that isn't just surfacey and silly, then find an astrologer and talk to them because that'll give you insights. And somebody who's done it for a bit and has, the gravitas to not just make it about predictions and when you'll find the love of your life and these kinds of stupid things. That's not what astrology is for. It was never meant for that. That's
Right.
just modern
Right.
curiosity. And, the sovereignty question is really big. Me as a human being, with AI everywhere and being tracked and followed, that's a real issue. I think the basic tension is hyper individualism versus collective systems. That's what I've just been saying. That's Aquarius versus Leo, and we have to find our place in that. So I think that's just all a big part of this time, but expect the unexpected. And I think it's funny that people are betting on it because betting is like, I'm sure this is going to happen. That's why I'm putting my money on it, which is just really weird. So I wouldn't bet, a cent on the future. I would really be curious. And so I think going at it with curiosity and speaking up to what feels right to us, I think maybe as a closing idea, I think the most important skill set that people need to develop to survive going forward is discernment. It is incredibly important. We all get bombarded with massive amounts of information every day, and we have to discern between what's usable, what's useful, and what's what we shouldn't pass on to others because it's garbage, and people automatically so easily just forward and like stuff, and it's not a good way to go through life, because we are part of the problem when we do that. So discernment means actually doing a little bit of research. You wouldn't go buy a car because your neighbor said, "Hey, I just bought this car, it's a cool car. Oh, great, I'll go buy one too." You would do a little research. And so um, do the same research on pretty much any message. And if you can't do the research, you don't have the time or the interest, then don't forward it, because you're part of the problem of fear mongering, of rallying up people, of rage baiting. All these kinds of things are very real, and they don't help. And when we think archetypally, we recognize the patterns that are going on, and we don't have to get outraged at everything, which, sure, rage and outrage have their place. There's no question that there's times that that's appropriate, and I definitely believe in marching when it's appropriate. But sometimes it's not appropriate to march. Sometimes there's other ways to do the work, and so it just depends on the situation. But knowing that there is a massive Uranian acceleration, which means massive fast forward into the age of Aquarius, which includes AI, alien disclosure, all these things that everyone is talking about, the great reset, the great change. This is out there now. So it's exciting. What's going to happen to human beings when we finally, collectively agree and have to admit, even though many have known for a long time, that there's other species out there that are and have been interacting with us for a long time. It's sort of like, duh, for most people, but for many, that's like, what, you believe in aliens? 40 years ago, if I'd said that, besides being an astrologer, people would say you're nuts. Well, that's what it means when a culture collectively becomes more conscious of things and can think outside of its limited box. And it's an exciting adventure for many, and it's absolutely terrifying for others to think outside of the box that they were trained in. And so that takes courage, and to know that when you do that adventure of thinking outside of your comfort zone and learning that there are other kinds of ideas than you have believed in all of your life, that you actually grow, and that risk is worth it, because while you're walking off a cliff, you don't fall.
Amazing. Dr. Laurence Hillman, thank you so much for joining me today on the PredictIt podcast. We'll take that discernment and try to use it, and all of our listeners hopefully will as well, work on discernment over the course of the next many months until the election season and beyond. But really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
You're very welcome. It was my pleasure. And to everyone, please vote. Your vote counts, and it matters. And I don't think anybody has the right to complain about anything who didn't vote.
Totally agree with you. Everyone go out and vote. Thanks everyone for listening, and have a good one.
Take care. Bye-bye, Jacob.
Thanks.